So please, if you will, welcome Dr. Sean B. Carroll.
Thanks, Doug. Let me get mic'd up here. Hey, thanks for coming out, everybody. Thanks for the hospitality here at Tyler. Thanks for the students that came this morning. Had nice, lively discussions. This is my first in-person talk in 2 years. So, I don't know, might be a little rusty, but I'm probably happier to see you than you are to see me. I have a feeling, those of you who may not be here very voluntarily tonight and have to pay close attention to my talk. So maybe I can make a couple promises, hopes for you. I really hope the subject of tonight is something that can appeal and register with everyone. So maybe as you're leaving tonight, you can shoot a gesture my way, socially acceptable gesture my way as to whether that actually happens. I just hope this is something that interests all of us as kind of living beings on the planet. So we're going to go out in the Serengeti in a couple minutes, but I want to give you some context. I've spent my career really as an indoor biologist, but as I started to see headlines like this, where over half of the world's wildlife has disappeared since 1970, and that trend has continued since this headline. Or I've read things like plans to possibly put a highway through the middle of Serengeti National Park in Tanzania, which would bifurcate the greatest animal migration route in the world. I'm just getting more concerned. Just as a biologist, this is somebody who's fascinated and concerned about life on this planet. And I felt that I kind of had to quote a recent movie, look up, get out of my own lab, and look around the world and spend more time with ecologists. It's just a fact in biology that those of us that work on genes and cells and molecules and things like that, we kind of live in different buildings and we publish in different journals. We don't know much about our ecology friends that are sort of working on nature on a different scale. So I started going to see parts of the world, sometimes accompanied by ecologists, and I really wanted to see, what kind of shape are things in? And I made a trip to Yellowstone with an ecologist, and I learned that really even some of the most protected places on the planet, including like the Serengeti, were at peril. So I thought, I want to see these places, and I actually wanted to take my loved ones to see these places, just in case maybe they might not be there, a few decades from now. So I'm now going to commit probably the worst sin one could do in giving a talk, which is I'm going to show you vacation photos from a trip made to Serengeti National Park with my family. So these are our three sons and my daughter-in-law, my wife Jamie, outside the very fancy gate, eastern gate of Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. And we loaded up into this vehicle. You're seeing the roof of the vehicle, and here's the sort of gravel road into the Serengeti. And this is June. You can see the grass is kind of brown. It's about knee-high. And all excited, with the top popped on this Toyota Land Rover. We're going to drive down this road and start looking at the magnificent wildlife of the Serengeti. And we start rolling down the road, looking left and right, looking left and right, looking left and right, not seeing anything until somebody spots this. So you may be able to see there's the top of a lioness in tall grass. And for me it's exciting, but I'm the only biologist in my family, and I'm thinking, if this is what wildlife spotting is like in the Serengeti, they're going to drop me off and go back to the lodge, okay? So we keep driving on, but this was kind of the dry part of the Serengeti, and we started to see little flecks, a little shimmer of water, and a little bit of greenery, and we kind of come up over a rise, and this is what we see. So everywhere I look, I see stripes. There must be a few thousand zebra here. They're coming down to this water hole and frolicking about. And I look up to the west, and coming down to the water hole, the dawn patrol, okay? And from that moment on, the Serengeti offered up sort of an unending canvas of animals of all sizes, shapes, and colors. From sturdy warthogs, lounging hippos, sleek impala, majestic giraffe. These are all home photos. These are all family photos, including this one. This leopard we spent about 4 or 5 private hours with this leopard while she had a freshly killed gazelle up in the tree, and she'd go up and feed, come down, take a little drink of water, go back up and feed, up and down, up and down. We're the only people there watching this. Over this time, looking across this landscape, I was just awestruck, absolutely awestruck. Nothing I had ever seen on television spoiled the thrill of seeing this for the first time. Nothing I had read had prepared me for just the sheer scope and enormous amount of wildlife. But as the days went on, kind of a little bit of an uneasy feeling came across me because I was looking. That's not a good thing. I said I was rusty. I also have 2 microphones on. I was looking, across this landscape, and I really didn't understand what I was looking at. Right? I'm a professional biologist. A lot of decades, right? I got the markings. I didn't understand what I was looking at. I didn't understand the simplest things, like why were there like so many wildebeest, but so few topi, which is a grazer of a very similar size. And that was upsetting to me because I've studied the animal kingdom my whole life at a different scale in sort of a different way. But I've studied, for example, the making of stripes and spots on animals. Granted, fruit flies and butterflies and things like that. But I've really been devoted to try to understand how animals are put together and how their patterns form. But I don't understand anything about that scene on the Serengeti. Now, one thing I did know from research is that at that cellular and molecular scale, inside bodies, animal bodies, our bodies, everything is regulated. The number of cells, the amount of each molecule in the cells, these things are maintained in certain ranges. This is what regulation is all about. And I thought, I wonder whether anybody understands how the Serengeti works. Why are there so many wildebeest and whatever number of something else? And I started doing some reading, but I thought, to understand how life works, this sort of successful program that biologists have used for the last half century is to try to figure out the rules of regulation. If you're a sports fan, this is very similar. If you encounter a sport, you try to figure out, well, what are the players doing? What are the rules that guide them? How does this thing work? And what we've been doing in sort of the molecular bioscience is we've been identifying key players, for example, molecules, whatever, something like insulin or whatever, and understanding the rules that govern their play. And then, from that knowledge, this is exactly what sparked a medical revolution over the last 50 years, is we've learned how to, for example, replace what the body is lacking or modify something that's broken and make that regulation work normally. When regulation doesn't work normally, we generally call that disease. And we're trying to generally fix that in the course of medicine. So I wanted to know, are there rules that regulate things on a larger scale in a place like the Serengeti? How are the numbers of animals and plants regulated in a vast wilderness like that? Does anybody know? Well, obviously, if nobody knew, good news for you would be this lecture would be over, but we still have 2 more hours to go. Just kidding, about 45 minutes, okay. So are there rules that govern life at larger scales? I refer to these rules in a book I wrote called The Serengeti Rules, because you can see them all on display in the Serengeti, and we're about to see them. But I could have named them anything else because they work across the globe in all sorts of situations, all sorts of ecosystems. And just like we do for medicine, where by learning the rules of, for example, how things work within our bodies, that gives us the tools, the knowledge to do medicine, I want to know whether we can use these Serengeti rules to help preserve or even cure ailing ecosystems, the ecosystems that we're all concerned about across the globe. So I want to start this discussion of the Serengeti rules with a little history about the Serengeti I thought you might find interesting. So the Serengeti ecosystem, which spans both Tanzania and parts of Kenya, really for like the first half of the 20th century, it wasn't visited very much, partly because the world was preoccupied with 2 world wars, but also it was hard to get to. There were various diseases that people were worried about going on in places like that. It wasn't really until after World War II that folks started visiting the Serengeti in any significant numbers, and some of those first folks were biologists. And biologists, were awestruck, just like I was, when they got to the Serengeti and said, look at all this stuff going on. And they did sort of what you might imagine scientists to do when confronted with that sort of spectacle. One of the first things they decided to do was to count all the animals they could count in the Serengeti to see what was there. Okay? So I'm going to show you footage from a documentary from 1959 called Serengeti Shall Not Die to show you how they counted the animals there. The first count was done by this father-son team, Bernard and Michael Jimmick, in their very handsomely painted plane, where with a couple other spotters, they climb into this plane with a clipboard. And then I'm going to show you graphically the very sophisticated techniques they use to cover the whole Serengeti. This is visual graphics circa 1959, where they're going to fly back and forth in a pattern for 2 weeks across the Serengeti, counting all the animals they can. Okay, so you're ready? Here we go. We're going to count the animals. You can do this with me. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. This is how you count animals in the Serengeti. Flying what they said was low and slow, 120 miles an hour, as low as they could off the ground without crashing the plane, counting all these animals with a clipboard for 2 weeks. Okay, so as they make this count, they're counting everything that's large enough to see from that altitude and at that speed. And your mind, you're already sort of thinking, how accurate could this be? Yeah, like they didn't count at night. And of course, the animals move. They move according to the plane, but they also move around the park. But nonetheless, they thought they could get a pretty good handle on the numbers of different kinds of animals in the Serengeti. And let me show you the results of the first survey ever taken of wildlife in the Serengeti, taken January 1958. They counted 99,481 wildebeest. Not 480, not 482, 99,481. They counted over 57,000 zebra, over 5,000 topi, 1,800 buffalo, just 60 elephants. Serengeti at the time was still recovering from the ivory trade, where lots and lots of elephants had been killed across East and Southern Africa. But altogether, not that total, but add in some other animals, 366,000 plus large mammals in total. They were stunned. Think about that, 366,000 large mammals. And in a book and in the film, they wondered aloud, were there enough plains, mountains, river valleys, and bush areas to maintain the last giant herd still in existence? This is what Bernard and Michael worried about. Could the Serengeti really sustain all of this life? Well, an answer to their question would actually materialize within a few years, and it wasn't the answer that they expected or feared. And that answer started to materialize when a young undergraduate, about 22 years old, arrived in the Serengeti with his professor for a summer's work. His name was Tony Sinclair. He came from Oxford in 1965, and he was going to study the birds of the Serengeti. Now, it turns out they needed some hands on those surveys of the animals, so they put him to work right away counting the large mammals in the surveys. And right away, a mystery appeared because they didn't do the survey every year at that time, but they had survey data from earlier years. And they saw, when Tony was involved in counting, for example, the buffalo, that there appeared to be a pretty substantial increase in the number of buffalo in the Serengeti in just about 4 years. As you can see, from 16,000 to 37,000. Now, Tony, in his few months in the Serengeti, he was just enchanted with the place. And he decided that after he finished his undergraduate degree, he wanted to come back and study the Serengeti for his PhD. And they said, well, Tony, how would you like to study buffalo? Can a bird man study buffalo? And Tony said, I'll study anything. So Tony then returned to the Serengeti after his undergraduate degree, and he spent the next 54 years in the Serengeti. Now, some of the first questions that he asked were really inspired by that first visit. He wanted to know, why were the buffalo increasing? This, in fact, became his PhD thesis, was to try to solve the mystery of why were the buffalo increasing. He really wanted to explain also sort of the great differences in the numbers of different kinds of animals. How did the Serengeti support just such different kinds of wildlife in pretty amazing numbers? And really in his heart, what he wanted to understand was, why is the Serengeti the way it is? This magical place, this sort of paradise for wildlife. Why is it the way it is? And I remind you, at the same time, we're figuring out from fossil digs that this is the general area that is sort of the birthplace of our species and our Homo sapiens ancestors. So, pretty important place. Well, first thing Tony did is he started focused on the buffalo, kept counting. And the first thing he wanted to figure out was, maybe that was a fluke. Maybe there was some some mix up in the survey, maybe they did some calculations wrong, whatever. Were the buffalo really increasing? So he kept counting the buffalo. And yep, the buffalo were still increasing. Now, all across the globe, this is just not something that was happening in the 1960s and early 1970s. Large mammals were not just increasing. Buffalo's a big animal, and they're increasing in this wild park. So he said, why would they be increasing? So this is the interactive part of my talk. Tony, and there's nothing complicated, there's nothing tricky about what I'm about to ask you. Tony had to come up with some hypotheses to test. Why were the buffalo increasing? So, take a stab. What's the first thing that would pop in your mind to see the numbers going up? What would you think? Go ahead, fire away. You can each throw one out. Take a shot.
So I was kind of thinking about, when there's a large increase in buffalo, there would be like a smaller amount of food available, so there would be a decrease, and maybe they're hitting it at an increased time.
So you'd say more food might be driving the rise in buffalo.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. Other ideas? Well, tell you what. Why don't we just check that idea out? It's the first idea that occurred to Tony. Extra points here in the front row. Okay. Good hypothesis. This is what hypothesis making is all about in science. You don't have to make it any more complicated. It makes sense. More food might be more animals. Turns out, from these aerial surveys, they were able to sort of survey the amount of forage that was around in the park. They even could calculate sort of the amount of grass that was there, et cetera. Turns out, no, it seemed like the amount of food was relatively stable over all these years. So, all right. So food doesn't look like it could explain, perfectly reasonable hypothesis. Doesn't look like it could explain it. Anyone want to come up with another hypothesis? Right there. Predators. So you'd say fewer predators? Did we rehearse this? Right? This is it, right? This is great science. You're doing it right here, live action. Okay. Fewer predators. So at the same time Tony got there, some other scientists were arriving and studying other groups of animals, including the predators. And the only predators large enough to take down buffalo are lions. So what's going on with the lions? Other direction. There's actually more predators. So it's not fewer predators. Okay. Good. Perfectly solid hypothesis. Now it's okay. And maybe some of you thought of food and predators, okay? So now this is going to be a little tricky. Can you come up with another explanation? Why might there be more buffalo thriving in the Serengeti? Could be a little more subtle. I think some of you with maybe farm experience might have a little insight into this. Take a shot. Yeah.
They're just breeding more?
Breeding more? Well, it's true that they're definitely breeding more. So you're wondering whether the females are having more babies?
Yeah, survival rate is high.
Perfectly good. So in detail, Tony was looking at survival rate, and it turns out that there is, great question, less mortality going on. Which then leads to the question, why is there less mortality going on? I'll just give you a shot in the back in the gray hoodie. So you guys say it louder, I just can't hear you.
Herds. They're in a herd.
They're in a herd, so they're more protected from predators. Good thinking, but remember the predators up in numbers. That's a really cool idea. It would be more survival. You're absolutely right. So the herds are bigger. That's the first time I've heard that answer in a crowd. So give yourself some credit. Turns out it's not the winner, but it's a great idea. Others, go ahead.
Better immune systems to protect against disease.
Okay, that's close enough to win the Jeopardy round, okay? Disease. Less disease. So, it turns out, and Tony knew that buffalo could get a lot of diseases. But there was one disease in the Serengeti that was notorious. And it was called cattle plague or rinderpest. Okay? It's caused by a virus very similar to the human measles virus. And it had caused terrible, terrible tragedy in East Africa repeatedly since it first arrived in the late 19th century. And it hit 3 species, keep these in mind. It hit domesticated cattle, which all the pastoralists of the area are dependent upon. It hit buffalo and wildebeest regularly. And look at, this is a scene from one of these rinderpest outbreak years. And what Tony knew was that there was a vaccination program going on. Somebody invented a vaccine for rinderpest that in the early 1960s, they were now going around East Africa and vaccinating the cattle of the herders. Okay? And he thought, maybe that's suppressing the virus in the ecosystem, and that's giving the buffalo a chance to thrive. All right? Perhaps, but it's kind of only circumstantial evidence. How could he get more direct evidence of that? Well, just like all of us, when we get infected by a virus, any viruses you have in mind? Okay, never mind. When we get infected by a virus, we make antibodies. When buffaloes get infected by a virus, they make antibody. And he thought, I'll look in the blood of buffalo for antibodies to rinderpest. And I'll look at buffalo of different ages. And when he got buffalo of different ages, got their blood samples, looked for antibodies to rinderpest, and plotted them, he got his first eureka moment. Because whereas older buffalo had a pretty high exposure rate to the virus, as indicated by the presence of antibodies, no buffalo born after 1964 had antibodies to rinderpest. It looked like the virus was disappearing from the Serengeti. So this is his first eureka moment. But there would be other ways to sort of validate this insight. And Tony thought I should look at another wild species. Which would that be? Wildebeest. Thank you. And so he started paying more attention to the wildebeest. He thought he was doing his PhD on the buffalo. He started paying more attention to the wildebeest. He's up in the airplane counting the wildebeest. And look at the wildebeest counts he comes up with over this time. I heard holy something from the front row. I love hearing that. 1977, they count over 1.4 million wildebeest. Now, first of all, remember the Jimicks who first did the surveys in the late 50s were worried whether the Serengeti could hold 360,000 mammals. You got 1.4 million wildebeest in the system now. Okay? So Tony did the same experiment on wildebeest that he did on buffalo. He looked at their blood for antibodies to rinderpest, checks them out. Same story with the wildebeest. None born after 1963 had evidence of exposure to rinderpest. So this virus, which was actually introduced through domesticated cattle in the late 19th century into Africa, caused actually periodic famine because it would wipe out the cattle to such a high degree. That virus was spilling over into buffalo and wildebeest. But if you vaccinated the cattle, you stopped that chain of transmission. And the buffalo and the wildebeest thrived. Okay? So all this time that Tony's figuring out what's going on with the buffalo and wildebeest, and this massive increase in wildebeest that you saw, other scientists are working in the Serengeti, and they're making some other observations. And I'm going to share 3 of them with you, and then we're going to see if we can connect the dots. Okay? So 3 observations. One has to do with fire. Fire is an annual occurrence in the Serengeti. There's a wet and dry season in the Serengeti, and late in the dry season, there's a lot of fire. And people were measuring the amount of the Serengeti that was burning, and they were looking at the intensity of those fires. And over that decade, during the wildebeest boom, they saw that a lot less of the Serengeti was burning. These are just different geographic parts of the Serengeti, looking at percent that was burning. They also noticed the fires were less intense. Okay? So put it in your mind, less fire and less intense fire. Other scientists studying other animals saw they're counting an increase in giraffes. And who doesn't like more giraffes, right? I stopped for every one I saw in the Serengeti. Guide almost left me at the side of the road, but okay. One more observation. Tony, there was a thinking at the time that the Serengeti plain, that trees were disappearing from the Serengeti plain, and that they'd be gone in a matter of decades. So Tony set up a system of taking pictures from the same point in the Serengeti over decades to see what was going on with the trees. And it was the exact opposite what everybody thought was going on. Now, this is kind of amateur monitoring, not what you would do from a Google satellite right now, and you wouldn't take your first picture on a cloudy day. But anyway, if you look at the foreground here, at the acacia trees and their density, they're relatively sparse here. You start to see them filling in a little bit here, filling a little bit more there, and decades later you can really see you really have an acacia forest. Okay? Less fire, more giraffes, more trees. All right? Stir that around your head. See if you can kind of piece that together and make some sense of it. All right, so here we go. So we know that the big change in the Serengeti is eliminating that virus, the rinderpest. And the effect of that, as we know, is there are now more grazers. over 1 million more wildebeest, 40,000 more buffalo. Okay? All right. What do they eat? Okay. So if there's a lot more grazers eating all that grass, what do you think that does to the amount of grass around? Oh, I gave you the answer. Oh, you're jumping ahead. Good job. And you have less grass. Less fire, exactly. So now you're suppressing the fires because the animals are eating up so much of the grass, which otherwise was sort of being left over when the animal populations were reduced. Okay, and if there's less fire, well, what influence will that have, for example, on trees? Bingo. Less fire, more trees. And this one may not be too obvious. You got to sort of think about the kind of animals, but with more trees, can you connect that to those guys? Yeah, because they eat acacia. More food. Not only that, with more trees, more nesting sites for birds, more camouflage for predators. More. So much of what the biologists were measuring, there was more of everything in the Serengeti over this decade. More trees, more giraffes, more birds, more wildebeest, more buffalo. Oh my goodness. Okay. So, when you think about this, and you ask this question, now you may know, I've got to give you one more little data point, that those wildebeest, they make a trek around the Serengeti in the course of a season, following the rains, about a 600-mile journey. And if you ask Tony Sinclair what makes the Serengeti the way it is, now what you've seen on TV, I bet in every program you've ever seen on the African savanna, you see a cat take down some antelope in the first 90 seconds, right? And you think, that's what it is. It's, predators killing antelope. No. If you ask Tony what makes the Serengeti the way it is, it's 1 million lawnmowers. It's this really humble, simple act of a massive number of animals working its way around the Serengeti, mowing the grass down, essentially sculpting that garden for all the other animals. And that the abundance of all these other creatures, predators, birds, giraffes, trees, were all being driven by the wildebeest action. Now the irony of this is, wildebeest, not the most charismatic animal. In fact, when I asked my family for pictures of wildebeest from our trip, they were the scarcest pictures in our collections. They're kind of homely, but they're really important. And I think a lot of us would go, we would go to the Serengeti and look at these things, and we like the giraffes. Everyone looks for the cats. They kind of ignore the abundant wildebeest. But those are the ones that make the Serengeti the way it is. And this brings me to my first Serengeti rule. So tonight, I'm going to give you a few sort of general rules discovered that you can see on effect on the Serengeti. And I'm going to give you 4. Took a while to get to this first one. They're going to come faster now. And when I get to 4, you're almost free and can go home, okay? And this is a little bit of a takeoff on Orwell, that some animals are more equal than others. And biologists call these keystone species. These are species that actually regulate community diversity. They have a disproportionate impact on the abundance and diversity of other creatures in the community. And wildebeest are a keystone. Now, that concept didn't come from the Serengeti. Tony Sinclair discovered the wildebeest were keystones in the Serengeti. It came from another biologist named Bob Payne working on the Pacific coast of the state of Washington in these tide pools, where he discovered that this creature, these starfish, they were keystones and that they stabilized this community of about 15 species in these tide pools. And when Bob removed these starfish, the whole diversity of the community collapsed and just one species, mussels, took over. So without this predator in this case, the community collapsed. And he came up with the idea with keystone. It has to do with the design of a Roman arch where, this is the keystone, which actually is necessary for the stability of both sides of the arch. You remove this keystone, the arch collapsed. So his idea was you remove the keystone, the community collapsed. And you can see the Serengeti without the abundant wildebeest was in a really different condition than when the wildebeest boomed, and the tide pools without the starfish, same story. Now, in terms of that kind of domino effect these keystones can have, because who would think, really, if I said, tell me how wildebeest affect the number of giraffes? I mean, I've shown you now, but when you land in a place, you'd be like, what do they have to do with each other, right? Nothing. But you can see that these domino effects can happen, and what I was showing you before, Bob Payne also coined a name to describe this cascade or domino effect, and he called it a trophic cascade. Trophic refers to the food chain. Trophic has to do with your level in the food chain. And really, it's grazing, which is affecting the fire regime, which is affecting the trees, which is affecting what the giraffes feed on. These effects are being mediated through the food chain, a trophic cascade. And that's already our second Serengeti rule, which is some species have really strong indirect effects on other species through trophic cascades. Okay, so two huge ideas in ecology: keystone species, trophic cascades. Again, first trophic cascades weren't discovered in the Serengeti, but Tony discovered them, how they worked in the Serengeti. All right, let me resume a little bit to the story of some of the animals in the Serengeti. You may have been thinking when you saw that huge number of wildebeest, did it just keep on going? Did they keep growing? Well, if they kept going, all of East Africa would be like 20 deep in wildebeest. So it turns out that year of 1.4 million wildebeest was a peak year, and that in subsequent decades, the numbers leveled off around 1 million. Well, this is going to get us into another part of how the abundance of creatures are regulated. One more idea is going to come out of this. And what I want you to think about is, how might the numbers of wildebeest be regulated other than by that darn virus, okay? What would control the number of wildebeest? Would they get to a certain number, but now they're kind of leveling off, and they're going to hover around 1 million. That's about where they are today, okay? Well, when you think about a food chain, maybe you've been introduced to this. Here's the wildebeest. They're grazers, right? They're eating food, right? They're eating grass. And the wildebeest are taken down from time to time by predators. So there's really kind of a simple way you can imagine how the number of something like a wildebeest would be controlled. And there's a simple sort of shorthand ecologists use to describe this, which is they could be controlled either from the bottom up by the amount of available food, or from the top down by predators controlling their numbers. So before I tell you how the wildebeest are regulated, I want to tell you something else about how sort of mammal numbers in Serengeti are regulated in general, because it's just one of my favorite. I wish I'd known this when I'd gone to Serengeti for the first time. It's just one of my favorite pieces of the Serengeti puzzle. Over a period of decades, remember Tony stayed there a long time. Over a period of decades, he and some collaborators tried to figure out the cause of death for all sorts of carcasses they found in the Serengeti, for all sorts of species. They maintained extensive logbooks, and eventually they analyzed the data. And when they looked and they asked how are different species regulated, they could figure out whether something was a target of predation, kind of had telltale signs on the carcass, or whether it maybe just died of starvation. You could also tell, for example, from the bone marrow condition and things like that, whether the animal might have starved. So they plotted this. I'll show you just to look at the graph. They plotted the percent mortality due to predation along here on the left, and they plotted it according to body size here on the right. Let's start up here on the upper left. So Oribi, which is maybe about a 20 kilogram, 40-pound animal, you can see their cause of death is almost always predation. There are about 10 predators in the Serengeti that can take down Oribi. Not just the cats, but jackals, hyena, large snakes, even large raptors. You kind of think what do Oribi parents tell a young Oribi when it's born? Someday, you're going to die. Lots of different ways to die in the Serengeti. Impala, same, high level of predation. Topi, high level of predation. One thing these animals all have in common up here is, besides dying at high level of predation, they reproduce pretty quickly. Okay? Let's go down here on the right. Maybe it's easiest for you to think about the elephant. Look at the level of predation of elephants, hippos, rhinos. Essentially zero. I mean, maybe a baby elephant might be taken, but essentially, statistically, virtually zero. Well, look at their body size. And what you're really seeing here in two extremes, I'm going to date myself with some old movies. This is kind of the live fast, die young lifestyle. And this is kind of the Marlon Brando all-you-can-eat lifestyle down here, okay? So these animals, by getting big, become impervious to predation. All right? So that's a life strategy. Get big, avoid predation. But of course, to get big, what comes with that? You need a lot of resources every day. These animals are eating like 200 pounds of grass a day. They got to drink a lot of water. Gestation, the reproduction is very slow. Gestation period is a long time. As you know, elephants have these family groups, et cetera, right? So this is a really different strategy than up here. But what you're really looking at is animals, and there's some that sort of fall in between. We don't need to spend much time on them. But there's really sort of two extremes. If you're small, vulnerable to predation, you're going to have to reproduce quickly to maintain your population. And you can escape predation by getting really large. So these animals are regulated from the top down. These animals are regulated by the availability of resources from the bottom up. Well, where do the wildebeest fall? They're regulated by food. But I want to give you a little bit, let you think a little bit. How can the amount of food regulate the amount of wildebeest? And it's almost think like a sort of a thermostat, which is when there's few wildebeest on the plain, as there were because of rinderpest, say in the late 50s, early 60s. They were at low density, but of course, I told you food was abundant. So the growth rate is high once you get rid of that virus. The growth rate is high when the food per capita is plentiful. Makes sense, right? Booming when conditions are good. But when they get to a certain level, now here's the deal. The Serengeti is on a wet, dry seasonal cycle. Late in the season, as things get dry, there's not much food left. That food is of very low quality. A fair amount of animals just perish of that. That's the bottleneck that the population goes through every year. Okay, so there's a winnowing that happens at the end of the season. So when you get to large numbers, and a lot of that food is then gone, well, then the numbers tail off, growth declines, numbers decline when food is limiting. So really, it almost kind of looks like a thermostat, right? When things are getting a little bit too cold, the population numbers turn up. When you overshoot, populations turn down. All regulated on a matter of density. As the more animals that exist in a particular area, the less food there is per capita, growth rate's going to decline. Okay? Why did I tell you this? Because it's our third Serengeti rule, which is the regulation of some species, and that's not just wildebeest, all those food-regulated species, elephants, buffalo, rhinoceros, giraffes, etc. The growth of those species is controlled according to their density. When they're at low density and food's abundant, they can boom. When they're at high density and food is scarce, they can either level off or crash. Okay. So I've shown you all these phenomena on the Serengeti. One, for the pure pleasure of understanding a magical, spectacular place on the planet. But I've also told you this because essentially every place is a Serengeti. Everywhere where a food chain exists like this, where basically there's plants, plant eaters, and predators feeding on those plant eaters, all of these roles can be in play. All of these phenomena can be in play. All rules. Keystones, trophic cascades, and density-dependent regulation. And this could be on a rose bush in your backyard. It could be at a local pond. It could be, of course, on a huge ecosystem like the Serengeti. And if this is true, if these rules are really important, well, this is knowledge we can use. It's knowledge we didn't have 50 years ago whatsoever. But now we know this much, and we can see these forces at work in all sorts of habitats all across the world, including, the oceans. So, if we're going to need to intervene in ecosystems because populations are dwindling, systems are falling apart, we need to know the rules of regulation. We need to identify the key players in a particular place. Those would be species in this case that regulate community structure. We need to understand the rules that govern their play, their interaction with the system. And then we got to think about replacing what is missing or somehow fixing the broken links that connect these creatures to other creatures. So what I want to wind up on tonight is two stories, sort of using these principles to upgrade wildernesses that have been downgraded by human activity. Okay, and the first example I'm going to give you is take you to a place you've hopefully had maybe a chance to read about, think about, or even have lucky enough to visit, and that's Yellowstone National Park here in the United States, often referred to as the American Serengeti because of its abundant wildlife and mammals and all that. Well, as I told you earlier on, I didn't understand this when I visited Yellowstone, but there were some weird things going on in the Yellowstone that was pretty evident by 1980s, early 1990s. And it has to do with this iconic tree, the aspen, western aspen. And botanists studying these aspen, when they looked at their age, which you can do, from tree rings and things like that, they saw that most of the aspen in Yellowstone were really old, essentially senescent. So they look at the age distribution of these aspen. It may be hard for you guys to see some of the detail here from the back, but what you're telling you is that a lot of these aspen were, more than a century old, and that there weren't very many young aspen from the decades of the 20th century. Where were all these missing aspen? What had happened? Okay? So we see a park and we see greenery and we see pretty trees and we think, this is lovely, this is perfect, this is paradise. Scientists look under the hood and they're like, something's amiss, something's weird, something's going on. All right, so one of the biologists studying this, Bill Ripple, is standing in a grove of aspen here, and he's got a big measuring stick and he's looking around at these aspen tree, and if you can see up the bark here, these trees have been heavily browsed. They've been hammered. And the animals that are tall enough to reach that are elk. So biologists started to think maybe the aspen are being stunted by excessive browsing from the elk in the Yellowstone system. All right? And they had another little clue. Why might there be a problem with excessive elk browsing? Well, again, go back to our food chain a little bit. If we're saying, aspen are the plants and elk are browsing on these aspen, and there may be, if there's excessive elk browsing, maybe there's too many elk. Well, why would there be too many elk in Yellowstone? Is there something missing? Fire away, right there.
The wolves.
Bingo. The wolves, it turns out, had been exterminated in the 1920s. There was a campaign across all the lower 48 to essentially eliminate wolves. But it turns out when you do that, of course, the things that wolves eat, deer, elk, etc., now have nothing to fear, and away they go. And their numbers are much higher without wolves than with wolves. So biologists thought, maybe we can set this system back. Now, 1924, so wolves have been missing. By 1995, wolves have been missing from Yellowstone for 70 years. So the idea was, let's bring them back. So here's a picture of first wolf being brought back into Yellowstone. It took quite a while to organize this effort. But think about this. If a predator like this has been missing from a system for 70 years, could you really expect that bringing them back, that you could actually push the system back to the way it was? After a 70-year absence? Okay, so wolves were released in 1995. What happened? Well, one of the first things happened was that, the wolves were released, they started reproducing, they sort of oscillate in number, but pretty much an overall decline in the number of elk to about a third the density they were at before. There's some other variables going on here. We don't need to get into them, but generally, wolves were taking down elk. Okay, so elk numbers were down. But if you start now looking at the trees and you say, I'm going to measure browsing on these trees, after wolf reintroduction, look at the browsing going down. And then look at the aspen height going up. And look at the time frame here. Remember, the wolves have been missing for 70 years. If I told you, if you put wolves back, maybe in 100 years, Yellowstone will be in a different state, you'd be like, oh, God, who's got 100 years to wait? So the scientists are being rewarded. They can measure things, probably within a decade and certainly within 15 to 20 years. It was pretty obvious. And they're like, okay, look what's going on with the aspen. But this wasn't all. To some people's surprise, when you look at other sorts of populations, let's look at willow. This is a picture from the same spot in Yellowstone before the wolf reintroduction and after. And what you're seeing in the foreground here is willow. And willow is a favorite food and building material of, it's on the slide. Yeah, you can get that one. Okay. Beavers, right? And look what's going on with beaver populations in Yellowstone. Of course, those beavers, in turn, by damming rivers and things like that, they create habitat for other animals, and the story goes on. So you bring wolves back, and you're having an effect on willow and beaver. Really, if I told you bringing wolves back leads to more beaver, you'd have a little trouble figuring out all those connections. It's a trophic cascade, right? It's a domino effect. And this brings me to my fourth Serengeti rule, the most important thing I'm going to tell you tonight. I think it's not very sciencey, but I really want you to take it home and take it to heart. I'm going to give you some more evidence for this. And that is that nature is resilient. I think to our relief, even a system that was sort of out of whack for almost a century in the Serengeti, for 70 years in Yellowstone, in a relatively short period of time, bringing the wolves back given the wildebeest a chance to thrive, the system changed, and the system became really much more robust, much more biodiverse. How does that happen? Well, you just got to give it a chance. And that chance means habitat. The habitat was there. Protection in this case from a virus, in the case of the wolves, protection from being killed, and a bit of time. But that time scale is a lot faster than I think than a lot of us would suspect, being able to see changes in a decade or two. Populations can rebound dramatically. Now, we've seen this, especially with the protection of individual species in all sorts of places in the world. Let me just give you some examples. Some of these may be familiar to you. So as we started to learn, particularly from various habits we had, whether it was whaling or hunting or DDT spraying or whatever, we were knocking a lot of species off the planet until we figured out, oh, wait, maybe we should stop what we're doing. So look at the time of where protection was started on just a handful of species here, the lows that these species were at in terms of numbers, and sort of where they're at now. I like to point out the bald eagle, which was down to fewer than 500 breeding pairs in the lower 48 due to DDT spraying in the late 1960s. New count, over 71,000 breeding pairs. I've seen bald eagles, more bald eagles in the last year than I think I saw in my life, just by accident, being in the right places, just saying, oh my God, there's a bald eagle. They're really roaring back. That's the breeding pairs. There's actually more than 300,000 bald eagles in the US. So you can see these numbers can come back. Given a chance, protection, time, as long as the habitat's there. All right, you might say, but what if more than just one species is missing? What if it's more than just a wolf missing or, bald eagles? Can these places really come back? Well, yeah, it could be much harder to restore, but that doesn't stop people from trying. So I'm going to close my story tonight on a place in southeastern Africa called Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. Gorongosa, which is in about the geographic center of the country. Mozambique's a very large country, about twice the area of California, bordered by the Indian Ocean on one side. Gorongosa is right in the geographic center. And it was a jewel of southern Africa in the 1960s. Here's a little film clip. You can sort of imagine some old 1960s music to it. So here's tourists coming in their little VW bug bus and going around Gorongosa National Park, and you can, looking at the animals. You can see the lions are so well fed, they're just sitting there next to the wildebeest goofing off, okay? So huge concentration of large wildlife in Gorongosa. Different kind of place than Serengeti. Gorongosa has a huge lake at the center. That's kind of the salad bowl where all the grazers eat and where the predators come to find their prey. But I told you that it was a jewel. It was a jewel until civil war broke out in Mozambique after its independence in the mid-1970s. And this is what Gorongosa looked like during that time. Unfortunately, it was the geographic center of the Civil War. It was really the mainstay of the rebel armies. Lots of fighting took place in Gorongosa. You can see some of the park buildings there. And the place was hammered. Here's one of those tourist vehicles after 20 years of Civil War. You can see the buildings are bombed out. The vehicles are all shot up. Scientists who had been working in Gorongosa in the early 1970s before the Civil War came back in the 1990s to see how things were. This is what they found. Okay, it's a bar chart, but the blue is before the war, animal census. The orange is after the war. So you could count 14,000 buffalo before the war. You could count about 100 after the war. 2,500 elephant, maybe about 200 after the war. On we go. 3,500 hippo, maybe down to about 100 after the war. So 95% or more of all large animals wiped out. And they were wiped out. Sometimes they were just, shot and eaten for food. Sometimes, like ivory was obtained from animals and they were traded for other contraband and things like that. So Gorongosa had pretty much been given up for dead. 20 years decimated. And it probably would still be that way today were it not for an American philanthropist who learned of Gorongosa's plight and kind of fell in love with Mozambique. His name's Greg Carr, and in 2004 he formed a private public partnership with the government of Mozambique to try to restore Gorongosa National Park. In 2015, a bit after my Serengeti tour, I was able to visit Gorongosa, and I've kept in close touch with them ever since. And let me just give you an update on that effort in Gorongosa. In 2000, there was probably fewer than 2,000 large mammals of all types combined. Those bar charts I showed you. 18 years later, more than 100,000. Elephants tripled, hippos tripled. There are virtually no detectable lions in Gorongosa in the year 2000. That population's now up to about 150. There's areas around Gorongosa where animals can migrate in, and mostly what's happened here, this number, is not due to reintroduction of animals. It is the animals that were there rebounding, some other animals migrating in from adjacent areas and kind of starting to fill the habitat, and protection, suppressing poaching and all that, and the animals are booming. And Gorongosa is a magical place today, back from the dead. There has been some reintroduction in Gorongosa because in that decimation of Gorongosa, things weren't removed proportionally. Some things got hit harder than others. And really, lions were the only significant predator left, and they were pretty reduced, very reduced in numbers. So one thing, now that Gorongosa is in much better shape with abundant mammals, it can now be a stronghold for some species that themselves are in trouble in the African continent. For example, wild dogs. Some of you might also know them as painted wolves. Down to about 7,000 in the wild. But with this protected place, the idea was maybe if they reintroduce wild dogs, that will help restore the balance to Gorongosa as well as give a stronghold for those dogs. So I just want to end tonight with a little wild dog footage because these animals are just so amazing. Let's just enjoy it. So they reintroduced a couple of packs of wild dogs. They've been thriving, reproducing, multiplying, and yes, eating and scaring the hell out of a lot of mammals. But this is the kind of balance you need in places. You need a balance between the predators and the herbivores, or else, as you know, the herbivores will overrun the place. So the wild dogs are doing well. So Gorongosa is a success story that almost nobody would have predicted. And let me just close again with the thought of Serengeti. I told you they were thinking about building a highway through the Serengeti, but I can give you an up-to-date report that, in fact, the roads in the Serengeti remain unpaved. And for goodness sake, let's keep it that way. Thanks for listening.